I'd like for us to read two passages from John as we begin. And the first one is in John chapter 4. And this is the account of Jesus with the woman at the well. And we're going to read this and then read something in chapter 7, and then we'll kind of back up a little bit and talk about context and also kind of relationship of things. One of the things that John does is that there's this constant correlation between the Jewish feasts and the events and the topics that take place in the Gospel of John. And we're going to be talking more today about the Feast of, and it's sometimes called Tabernacles, Booths, which is going to be a feast in October, but we'll come to that in just a little bit. As Jesus is speaking with the woman in the well, this comment is made as the disciples have left. And in John 4:7, Jesus says to her, will you give me a drink? And the woman has come to draw water. The Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? And I always find newer translations will have parentheses, and these little footnotes are given in different parts of the accounts. And John just says, Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And it's always interesting to wonder who may have been the original readers of the book. And like I said, we don't know all the details, but if this was only a Jewish audience, they would already know that. And again, that just strikes me as interesting that he just makes this little comment, Jews do not associate with Gentiles. Well, if this was a purely Jewish audience, you wouldn't need to say that because they would already understand that. And then Jesus said, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you, and notice this expression, living water. Sir, you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his herds? And Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to everlasting life. And the woman said, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and will have to keep coming here to draw water. It's very interesting, and this happens all through the gospel accounts. Jesus is always drawing either a parallel, object lesson, or something between something that's physical and maybe even temporal, and something that's spiritual and eternal. And in this case, how historic is this? Jacob's well. In one sense, the father of Israel. And Brother McCord referred to Jacob as heel grabber, the guy who trips you up, because he's always conniving and scheming. And remember, he wrestles all night with the angel, and the angel touches his thigh, and his name then becomes Israel. And remember, El in Hebrew name will have something to do with God, and Israel is he who wrestles with God. And you wonder who's going to win if you start wrestling with God. But in a sense, when I hear the word Israel, that's virtually a summary of the history of Israel till Jesus comes. They're constantly becoming unfaithful, in a sense, spiritually, wrestling with God, and that's just one of the things that takes place. So here is a Samaritan woman, and the Samaritans are those who returned after Israel goes into captivity. They go into captivity about 721, taken by the Assyrians, and then they sent a few of them back, and they have intermarried, and that's why the Jews always looked down on them because they were a mixed race. But with all that going on, Jesus stops and says, here is physical water. And then he wants her to be thinking about living water, which is obviously something spiritual and something that's very, very different. I want us to go ahead and turn to chapter 7. And we're going to read in John 7, verse 37. And again, if you don't have an outline, there are outlines on both communion tables, which will be helpful here in just a second as we look at something. I'm in John 7, verse 37. Let me turn the page. On the last and greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "If a man is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within him." By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. And again, here is a comment about water, which we'll discuss and talk about here in just a second. And Jesus talks about, if anyone is thirsty, let him come and drink. And throughout the Gospel of John, you have this sense of belief and unbelief. Do you remember the key statement in 20, 30, and 31? Many other signs and wonders Jesus did in the presence of disciples. They're not written in this book, but these are written, why? So that you may believe, and that believing you may have life in his name. And so in the Gospel of John, close to 90 times the word believe is used, but it is always a verb. Remember, noun, person, place, or thing? Someone help me, what's a verb? Action or activity. And the word faith, as John will use in 1 John, is not in the Gospel of John at all. And that to me is very interesting, and it to me has to be intentional. If you use a term close to 90 times, and it's always a verb, and it's never a noun, then that's a very intentional thing. But notice what's going to happen, and we're at the heart of this when we come to chapter 7 and 8. As people start to believe, the opposition is going to always increase, either equal or greater than. And as we get closer to the cross, and people believe and some don't, then that opposition between those who hear and believe and those who hear and scoff and don't believe is very, very strong. So at the beginning, I wanted to, and I did a clip from an earlier lesson, and it just says there were 3 major Jewish feasts in the Old Testament. And again, I never want to insult your intelligence, but I did this for my kids when they were 5 years old. There are 2 places that 3 feasts are mentioned in the Old Testament. They're in chapter 23 of the 2nd and 3rd book. Follow? There are 2 places that the 3, and there's another one like in Deuteronomy 16, but we won't worry about that. But there are 2 places that the 3 major feasts are mentioned, and they're in Exodus and Leviticus, chapter 23. And you can go back and locate those and find those. The first, and the one that we have a lot of association with, is the Feast of Passover. And Passover is going to commemorate the blood being placed on the sides and the tops of the doors in Egypt, and the death angel passing over and the people being delivered. And just before they go out of Egypt, then the Passover then is this continual reminder, and the Passover lamb is commemorated then. Pentecost is 50 days later, and this is going to be on the first day of the week. And Pentecost is also a celebration having to do with the harvest. And when we did our Old Testament survey, we mentioned the barley harvest typically ripened and was harvested before Passover. Then the men would make the journey down to Jerusalem. They would be there for Passover. And then as they come back, the wheat would ripen. And then the wheat harvest then would take place in these 50 days between Passover and Pentecost. And as we came back from South Texas a week or so ago, the wheat harvest is on, and the guys are cutting from deep South Texas, and they'll end up in Canada. My dad always had 300 acres of wheat, and when the wheat gets really ripe, at least in western Oklahoma, you're always watching the southwest to see if there's any dark clouds forming, because that hailstorm can come in or heavy rain and just destroy your crop. But until the harvest gets done, everything's put on hold. You don't repair anything, you don't go fishing, and when it's finally dry enough you can get in and get the wheat cut, everything is on hold. And then there's always kind of this collective when you finally get the wheat crop in. Well, annually, and you think these are agricultural, rural people, then we finish the barley harvest, we have Passover, the wheat is going to ripen, we go back home and we finish the wheat harvest, and then we get to go to Jerusalem for Pentecost. And isn't it interesting, the first spiritual harvest of the early church takes place when Jews from every nation under heaven are assembled in Jerusalem, and there came a sound as a rush of a mighty wind, and all the events of Acts 2 take place, and the spiritual harvest of humanity is going to begin on Pentecost. Then they go through the summer, and then as they headed toward the fall, then the Feast of Tabernacles, booths sometimes it's called, was in October, and all of the fall harvest had been completed. And whether there were olives, grapes, whatever else was ripened in the fall, there was another seasonal harvest, and people would go to Jerusalem, and they would literally build these booths, these tabernacles, and can I use the word camp out? Okay? They would camp out for a week. And it's a time of worship, it's a time of celebration, but again, from the rural farmer's point of view, everyone is also kind of going, we've got the fall harvest done. I mentioned this, we did the Old Testament. Boy Scout jamborees are a fascinating thing. You know, Boy Scouts get together in whatever it is, 3 or 4 or 5 days. And if you go to a Boy Scout jamboree, there's always something cooking. We had a scoutmaster that could make peach cobbler in a Dutch oven that was just to die for. And, you know, we'd sometimes would put potatoes and put, you know, we were always cooking something. So if you go to a Boy Scout jamboree, there's fires, there's camps going on, but someone's always cooking something, there's always these smells. Well, you just imagine thousands and thousands of people coming to Jerusalem, and we camp out for a week. And it's just a time of celebration, a time of thanksgiving. And they are going to remember that Israel was in the wilderness for 40 years, and they lived in tents. And so these are makeshift shelters that they make for that particular time. We'll come back to that in just a second. What I wanted you to notice, and this is why I wanted you to have an outline if you have one, in John chapter 2 and verse 13, there is a reference, and notice there's a stereotype, a repeat that's given. The Passover of the Jews was at hand. And let's go ahead and do all three of these. Drop down to 6:4. The Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. And then at 11:55, the Passover of the Jews was at hand. So this is the reason why we say the ministry of Jesus took place 3 years, because we don't have any time reference like this in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Luke is the one who tells us Jesus was about 30 years old when the ministry begins. But if it wasn't for John, we wouldn't have any time frame for how long the ministry took place. And so we have at least a minimum of 3 feasts that are given in the Gospel of John. This is the other thing that's just, to me, just amazing, both in terms of the human writers and then obviously inspiration. Only 7% of the Gospel of John is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let me say the same thing the other way. 93% of John is not in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so how can you tell the same story and end up at the same place and talk about primary same event as the cross and only share 7% of the same material? And so what John does very uniquely, and my personal opinion, remember that description of the apostle who was leaning back on the Lord's breast during the Lord's Supper because they were laying down on cushions on their elbows? And I think John's the one who was right here. And so both as an eyewitness and as one who was that inner circle of Peter, James, and John, then the Apostle John sits back and to me reflects and looks back. Here are the things that took place and the things that happened, but John chooses to intersperse predominant themes that he's going to write about, and then here will come the feast, and these themes and these feasts are always interwoven within the Gospel of John. But let's go back to 2:13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And then you'll notice in 2:23 again, he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast. Many believed in his name, and when they saw the signs he was doing. And again, the book written to believe. Now, when we come to chapter 5 and verse 1, John doesn't tell us which feast this is, and there's various opinions about what it may be. But notice, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and again, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So at least we have twice that we know of that Jesus has gone to Jerusalem, and typically, most of the time, the Jewish men 3 times a year made this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Now, they typically, and we're going to see this with Jesus and his brothers, they typically are going to travel in groups. You know, if you're if you're a band of robbers or thieves or crooks or whatever, and you're going to have hundreds and hundreds of people journeying, you're best not to be traveling by yourself. And do you remember when Jesus is 12 years old? There's enough people, they travel for an entire day and they don't miss him. So they're with a group of people, both for safety and everything else. It's a ballpark, but I always like to have something similar. Bill, how long would it take you and I to walk to Tulsa?
I don't know how long it would take you. I would not be doing it.
But you just kind of give you some kind of context. You just imagine a group of people walking from Oklahoma City to Tulsa. This is not an overnight thing. This is kind of a major traveling expedition. And if you live in Upper Galilee and you follow the recommendations of the law of Moses, you do this 3 times a year. So just kind of let that sink in. And so while Jesus' ministry, the early part of the ministry, is going to take place in Galilee, then I'm confident that he and the disciples made additional trips down to Jerusalem other than the ones that we have. But at least when we come to John 5 and 1, we have the second record that they have gone there. Now, when we come to chapter 6 and verse 4, the Passover feast of the Jews was at hand. So here is our second Passover, and that's where, again, we get our time period that takes place there. Then in 7 verse 2, we're coming to where our context is today. John tells us the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles was at hand. So if you go back and think late March, April, Pentecost, then John's going to be telling us, the Feast of Tabernacles, October, was taking place, and another feast is at hand. Now, if you have your New Testament, turn to John chapter 5, because here's something very significant that takes place. On one of those occasions, when Jesus is at Jerusalem, he is going to heal a man who has been a cripple for 38 years. Let me say it this way, and I've mentioned this before. I listened to a lecture on muscular atrophy, where our muscles decay, and this guy was involved in all kinds of rehab and other stuff. But we're back to 1972. He said if you took Mark Spitz, who had won 6 or 7 gold medals, and put him in bed for a month and didn't let him exercise, and then wheeled him over to the pool and pushed him in it, he would drown before he couldn't swim to the other end of the pool. A month of an Olympic swimmer just laying in bed and not exercising. His muscles would atrophy, they would decay. Just imagine being a cripple for 38 years. Calluses, you may be carried around and other things. And this is something that we'll anticipate, Lord willing, next week. Jim Woodruff had this wonderful expression: John is the story of the unbelievable in the light of the undeniable. And so it's unbelievable that a man who has been crippled for 38 years is told, rise up and walk. I took 1 dose of Coumadin once, and I was in the hospital for 5 days. I had like bugs crawling up and down my back. It felt like I had a roving rash that would move from different thirds of my body. I was sleeping about an hour and a half a night, getting 4 shots of Benadryl. I was hospitalized. I'm glad I didn't take 2. I just took 1 and just had this just major allergic reaction. And the weekend nurse, and the weekend nurses were fabulous, she went next door to the head of dermatology at OU and explained what was happening. The lady said, you're never going to slow this down with shots. You're going to need to give him a steroid cream bath and attack this from the outside in. I said, I'm up for anything. So rotisserie chicken, I turned sideways, and Sheila covered 1/2 of my body. We put a fan on, let that dry. Rotisserie the chicken, you turn it over the other side, do the other half. And from 7 o'clock that night until 5 o'clock the next morning, I had 6 blankets and a sock cap and hot chocolate, and just had chills and just shook all night long, and then finally it broke. But anyway, I'd been in bed for 5 days. In the wheelchair going down the hall, I felt like I was in a Star Wars movie with things going shoo. Just moving in a wheelchair was just amazing. And I had to have help to get out of the wheelchair into the car because I had been bedfast for a week. How amazing is it that a guy who's crippled for 38 years is told by Jesus, stand up and walk? But here's what's significant. As this takes place and the questions are asked, why did this happen? In verse 16, Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, and the Jews persecuted him. And when you keep reading, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his Father, making him equal with God. So when I read through the Gospel of John 5:18, the healing of the cripple is a very significant point, because Jesus is a marked, wanted, hunted man in Jerusalem from this point until they finally kill him. And again, remember, belief and unbelief. And as belief starts increasing, the forces of unbelief get stronger and stronger. And so when we read this discussion with Jesus and his brothers, are you going to Jerusalem? This is a dangerous place. And it will be a dangerous place all the time until they actually crucify him. That will begin from chapter 5 and verse 1. Let's do 2 others and then we'll move on. In John chapter 10 and 22, John tells us the feast of dedication was at hand. And about 163 BC, Mr. Maccabees and his 5 sons revolted against the rule of the Syrians, the Seleucids, and they finally took over the temple again and they cleansed it. And it was done on December the 25th, 163 BC. And this is Hanukkah. And some Jewish people still celebrate Hanukkah today, having nothing to do with Christmas whatsoever, 163 BC. And John just says, oh, it was wintertime. So here's another marker. We know Jesus was in Jerusalem on December the 25th in John 10:22. And then the final one is John 11:55. And this is going to take us to the crucifixion and the cross. And this is the third time the Passover is mentioned. I just want you to run your eyes down, and we're not going to list these individually. But if you'll notice in John, and here again is this correlation between feasts and events, in the Gospel of John, on the left-hand side, there are 7 signs. And rather than using the word miracle occasionally, use the word wonder. Then there are 7 signs that are given in the Gospel of John. And Lord willing, next week we're going to look at the giving of sight to the blind in chapter 9. And what you have, as you notice, and I put these indented just a little bit, there are also 7 I ams. And so what you have on one side is that you have 5 signs. And when I read the signs, I always think this tells us what Jesus did. And after the 5th sign, then Jesus starts saying, I am. And you talk about getting Jewish blood to boil. Where is the original I am? Oh, the burning bush. I am who I am. And not only does he heal a man and claim to be at one with the Father, then he starts using these I am statements, which has echoes of deity and God within them. And of course, it's true, he is. But if you listen to this from the Jewish ears, this is further just stirs the pot and makes things worse and worse. And he'll start saying, I am the bread of life. And then we're going to hear, I am the light of the world. Now, if you have your outline, just turn over very quickly. And this is just a summary, and there's a lot more that could be said. We're going to read the last bottom paragraph of this. And the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, again, they camp out. It's a week to remember that God's people were in the wilderness. But here's just a brief summary, and a lot more can be said. What are some things that took place during the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths, each year? And I also just put this reference. Do you remember while they were in the Old Testament, the water flowed from the rock? Moses both strikes the rock when God tells him to talk with it and other things. At this feast, there were ceremonies with the pouring out of water and the lighting of a great candelabra, which is said to illuminated every house in Jerusalem. And this seems to be finished by the 7th day. The leafy shelters in which people lived during this feast were taken down on the 7th day, and it was because of these traditions of water and light that Jesus spoke about being the living water and then the light of the world. So let me pause just for a second. Do you see what I'm saying again by way of correlation? As we go through these different feasts with the activities and the things that happen within the Jewish people and their customs, then Jesus is going to teach and talk with people with events that correlate with that. And this last paragraph says, the Feast of Booths was a very happy feast, and this is just my observation. I think of this as the Jewish Thanksgiving. You know, we're in the fall, we've got all the crops in and everything. And I've told you growing up, we would have 90 to 110 people for Thanksgiving. And Claudia, if we're having it at your house, all you need to do is either 4 turkeys and 5 hams, and we'll bring everything else. And a group of us will go to the church building and get tables and chairs. And if you have Thanksgiving with 110 people in your house, then it's just quite an event. And at some point, the songbooks come out, and we're going to sing. It was just always something we all look forward to. And that's the tone of tabernacles and booths. But during this event, it marked the end of the year's work. The harvest was safely in, so everyone was merry, and people carried bunches of leaves and lived in these leafy shelters during the duration of this. And there were times then the priest would go to the pool of Siloam and take vessels and would bring water from the pool of Siloam into the temple. And this again reminded them, we're talking about the wilderness and Moses. God caused water to flow from the rock, and we're going to have these candles. People are going to, it's sometimes even called the Feast of Lights in terms of the activities. And so these are two major events that took place. Now let's put this on pause just for a second. Major event at Passover was what? The killing of the Passover lamb. And Lord willing, we'll come to this if we're all still here in the fall. They have 3, I call them killings in the temple. You can't kill the lamb at home. There's 3 shifts where they kill lambs in the temple. And Leon Morris says, in my mind, the Lamb of God is hanging on the cross outside the city while the Jews are killing the Passover lamb in the temple. Correlation between feasts and events, and all these details that John gives us about the life of Jesus correlate with the feasts that are going on, and that's part of the reason why his account is so unique, because he correlates the events in the life of Jesus with the feast. But at our Feast of Tabernacles, then everyone is aware that at a point in time, the priests go and they're going to get water from the pool of Siloam, bring that in. There's candles both in the temple, and there's records where people would say the whole city was just illuminated. My great-grandmother was 18 years old when she came to Indian Territory on a train with 3 boys that were 4 and under. She got married at 14 years and 9 months, and so by 18 came to Indian Territory with 3 little bitty guys and got off on a train at Doxy. In talking with her, she said, the biggest change that has happened in my life has been the coming of electricity into our farm homesteads. What do you get to do before electricity? Candles, kerosene lamps, and other stuff. And so if you live in a countryside where you don't have city lights, can you imagine what Jerusalem looks like when during the Feast of Tabernacles that many, many people, both the temple and households, are going to light these extra candles? And what is Jerusalem going to be? A city that's set on a hill. Do not let your light be covered. Be like a city on the hill. And that's what Jerusalem would be, being the city on the hill with all of this light that's there. Then this would be a part of that particular feast. Now, I want us to look in John chapter 7 and verse 1. And what is very interesting here is that John tells us that Jesus is in Galilee, and he was staying away from Judea because the Jews there were wanting to take his life. And you see what I'm saying? All the way back to the healing of the crippled man, then they have started this, and Jesus is very aware of this. John tells us that his brothers do not believe in him. And you remember, it's in Mark chapter 6 that we have a list of at least 6 of Jesus' siblings: James, Joseph, Judas, Simeon, sisters. So we're going to have a minimum of 6, maybe 7 or 8, but we know at least Jesus has 6, kind of call them half brothers and sisters. And they're asking Jesus, aren't you going to go and be a public figure? And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to go, at least at this time. And John tells us very specifically that his brothers did not believe in him at that particular time. Isn't it interesting that between the crucifixion and the 40 days, that when we come to the upper room in Acts chapter 1, we're going to have the apostles, and we're going to have Mary, and who else is there? The Lord's brothers. Something is going to happen between the crucifixion and resurrection and Acts chapter 1, where the brothers who had been unbelieving up to this point now become a part of that early group. And I believe the writer of the book of James is the Lord's half-brother, because James and John, that James is going to be beheaded in Acts chapter 12. And so the writer of the book of James is going to be the Lord's brother. I also believe that the book of Jude is written by the Lord's half-brother. And something happened in that 40 days where the brothers who had been unbelievers then are a part of that group. And I tell people, if my brother was the Messiah, I'd be one of the hardest ones to convince. You're thinking, not him. Somebody else, but not him. And if you know my brother, it's even funnier. And so I'm empathetic with these brothers, but they come to believe and become pillars and very important part of the growth of the early church. If you turn the page on the back side, there's all these discussions and anger and hostility that's going to take place. And Jesus is going to talk about living water, which we've already read. When you come into chapter 8, Jesus is also going to say, I am the light of the world. And notice here again are two of the major events during the Feast of Tabernacle and the water that comes from the pool of Siloam. Jesus then will start, again, physical to spiritual. Jesus will start saying, I am living water. And then he's going to start saying in chapter 8 and verse 12, I am the light of the world. I just want you to notice, and this is about halfway down on the outline, Nicodemus is going to at least stand up for Jesus. And John gives us 3 snapshots of Nicodemus. He comes to Jesus at night. He raises the question before the Sanhedrin. And then he is going to be one of the ones who is going to bury Jesus. And when Jesus starts talking about the living water, he talks about the coming of the Spirit. And this is very interesting in that John says the Spirit had not yet been given because Jesus had not yet been glorified. And what's interesting to me is that Peter, James, and John are with Jesus at the Mount of Transfiguration, but John doesn't include that event in the Gospel of John. Leon Morris just made an interesting comment. He said, we never trifle with Scripture, but when you hear the word glorified in the Gospel of John, you could substitute the word crucified and not change the meaning at all. The most physically horrendous way that people had devised to die was the crucifixion, and being glorified in the Gospel of John is to be crucified. And this is going to fulfill the will and the purpose of God. So halfway down, you'll see Roman numeral 2, the living water and the light of the world are talked about in those things. I'd like to give you just some things. I love these verses in chapter 8, and I like this term, anchor passages. These are some passages that to me are just very, very significant, both in their original meaning and in our context today. Jesus says, I know where I came from and I know where I'm going. It's amazing what we can endure while we are in this life if and when we know where we came from and we know where we're going. And it's amazing how many people don't know either one of them today. And if Jesus had waited for the approval of either the crowd or the apostles to be crucified, he would never have been crucified. Totally swimming upstream, going against the current, going against the tide. But you have this constant sense, I am the Father are one. I know where I came from, and I know where I'm going. I told you, you will die in your sins unless you believe, and here it is again. I am He. and a term that Jesus uses with frequency that, again, would cause the other people some consternation. And then look at number 3. I always do the things that please him. And I think of this in terms of, again, of an anchor passage. How much better would each of our lives be if we have a goal, we have an ambition, I want to do what pleases God. And these verses, I know where I came from and where I'm going, and I do what pleases him, is always something very significant. And then a verse that we know that's very significant, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And just anticipate, as we head toward the healing of the blind man, faith is increasing, and with the increasing of faith will also come the increasing of opposition until they finally get him crucified, which had been their plan since John chapter 5. God bless.